My name is Amara Osebonsu. I'm 35 years old. And the afternoon my sister looked me in the eye and told me to hand over my savings was the afternoon I finally understood that the story my family had been telling about me had never been about who I was, only about what I could be made to provide. It happened at my parents' house, in the dining room with the oval table that seats 8 and usually seats 5, on a Sunday in late October that I remember because the light through the side window was the particular flat gray of afternoons that have already decided to become evenings. My sister Yawanda sat across from me. My mother sat at the end, nearest the kitchen. My father was in his chair. Yawanda said, "You have no responsibilities. Hand over your savings. That's what sisters do." My mother nodded and said, "She needs it more than you." My father looked at me from his chair and said, "You've always been the selfish one." I stood up. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I said, "No." Then I walked to the front door, opened it, and left. I drove home on roads I had driven hundreds of times, and I did not turn the radio on, and I did not call anyone, and when I got to my apartment I made tea and sat at the table in the kitchen and let the quiet settle around me until it felt like something I had chosen rather than something that had been imposed. What none of them knew, what none of them had any reason to know, was that the savings they wanted me to hand over were not the largest thing I had built. Not by a significant distance. I want to tell you about the savings first because the savings are where the story starts and because the number matters. I had, at the time of the Sunday in October, $43,700 in a personal savings account that I had been building since I was 23. I had built it the way I built everything, incrementally, consistently, without announcing the progress to anyone because announcing progress had never been something my family responded to in ways that made me want to repeat the behavior. The $43,700 represented 4 years of disciplined saving from a salary that was not, at 28, exceptional. I was a graphic designer at a mid-size agency called Mercer Holt Creative, where I had been working for 3 years, and where I was good at my job in the specific, documentable way that produces consistent work and quiet raises, and the kind of professional reputation that accumulates without drama. The savings were not the point of the savings. They were a precondition. I had been planning for 2 years before the October Sunday to leave Mercer Holt and start something of my own. Not immediately, not in a year, not recklessly, but with the particular long-game patience of someone who has identified where she wants to go and is building the infrastructure before taking the step. I had been doing client work outside my employment hours, within the boundaries my contract permitted, accumulating a portfolio and a client list and a set of working relationships that would, at the right moment, constitute the foundation of a studio. The savings were the runway. They were not available for redistribution. My family did not know about the plan, for the same reason they did not know about most of what I was building. The architecture of my family's attention had never included a space where Amara's plans were tracked or anticipated or discussed. Yawanda's plans were tracked. Yawanda's mortgage, Yawanda's car, Yawanda's 3 children and their school fees, and the restructuring of her husband Khalad's business. These were the topics at Sunday dinners, the subjects that organized the family's concern. Yawanda was 4 years older than me and had, from early in our shared life, occupied the role of the daughter whose needs were legible and therefore primary. My needs had always been less legible, partly because I had learned not to present them in the register the family could read, not from strategy, initially, but from the simple accumulation of evidence that presenting them produced nothing useful. Partly because the work I did, design, visual communication, the particular craft of making things look and feel like what they were meant to be, was not the kind of work my parents had a framework for valuing. My father was a civil engineer. My mother had worked in hospital administration for 30 years. They understood outputs that were measurable, careers that had ladders you could see. What I did lived in a different register, and they had filed it without malice, as something between a hobby and an employment arrangement, not as a profession that would compound. I had been compounding for 4 years. They did not know. Let me tell you about Yawanda, because the story is not fair to her if I don't. Yawanda is not a cruel person. I want to be precise about that because it matters to how I understand what happened and what came after. She is a person who had been, for her entire adult life, the center of a particular kind of family attention, and who had absorbed the logic of that attention so completely that it had become indistinguishable from how she saw the world. In the world as she had experienced it, resources in the family moved toward Yowanda's household when Yowanda's household needed them because that was the established pattern, and established patterns feel like natural law from the inside. Khalad's business restructuring had cost more than anticipated. The mortgage had a variable rate that had adjusted upward twice in 18 months. The school fees for 3 children at a school they had chosen for its outcomes were substantial and non-negotiable in Yowanda's accounting. She had looked at her situation and looked at the family's resources and performed the same calculation she had always performed, and the calculation had produced Amara. She did not think of it as taking something. She thought of it as rebalancing. My mother thought of it the same way. My father's framing was older and less charitable. "You've always been the selfish one" was a sentence he had first deployed when I was 14 and had declined to give Yowanda my birthday money, and he had returned to it at intervals over the following 21 years with the consistency of someone who found it useful precisely because it required me to disprove a negative rather than establish a positive. I had been disproving that negative for 21 years. On the October Sunday, I stopped. The weeks after the Sunday were quiet in the way that follows a decision that was a long time building. My mother called twice in the first week. I answered the second call, told her I was not going to give Yowanda the savings and that the conversation on that topic was closed. She said I was being stubborn. I said I was being clear and that there was a difference and that I hoped she would come to see it. She ended the call. She did not call again that week. Yowanda did not call at all. This told me something. Yowanda calling would have required her to engage with me directly, person to person, outside the structure of the family table where the arithmetic of need was already established. Without the table and the witnesses and the established pattern, the request would have had to be a request, one person asking another for something, and I think she understood, without needing to articulate it, that the request on those terms would have looked different than it had looked on Sunday. I went back to work at Mercer Holt. I had a brand identity project for a restaurant group that was due at the end of the month, and I worked on it with the same attention I always brought to work that interested me, which this did. I also, in the evenings and on Saturdays, continued the work I had been doing outside my employment hours. 3 ongoing clients, a 4th in conversation, the portfolio expanding by increments. I had a meeting with a woman named Theodora Ike, who was a small business accountant I had started working with 6 months earlier to get my freelance finances into a proper structure. I told Theodora where the savings stood and what the plan was. She told me the structure looked sound, suggested 2 adjustments to how I was categorizing certain expenses, and said that if the client pipeline held at its current rate, I could be looking at the right moment to make the transition in 12 to 18 months. I wrote that down. 12 to 18 months. I should tell you what the freelance work was because it matters to what happens 7 years later. I specialized in brand identity for small and medium businesses, the visual language of a company, the way it presented itself to the world through its name and its logo and its colors, and the particular feeling it generated in the people who encountered it. It is work that looks simple from the outside, and is not simple, that requires the ability to understand what a business is trying to be and to translate that into something someone can see and immediately recognize and remember. I was good at it in a way I had understood for several years and that my clients had confirmed through repeat work and referrals, and the particular vote of confidence that is someone giving you the job of making their business visible. The 4 clients I had at the time of the October Sunday became 6 by March. 6 became 9 by the following autumn. I left Mercer Holt 18 months after the Sunday, on a Thursday afternoon that I had been anticipating for long enough that it felt less like a leap and more like a step I had been in the process of taking for 2 years. I registered Osei Bonsu's studio with the help of a solicitor named Graham Fairley, who had been recommended by Theodora and who handled the incorporation with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom this is an entirely routine procedure and who does not feel the need to comment on the fact that it is not routine for the person sitting across from him. I set up an office in a shared workspace on Carmichael Street, in a building that housed 8 other small creative businesses, and that had, in the common area, a coffee machine that was better than anything at Mercer Holt and a particular quality of ambient focus that I found, to my mild surprise, genuinely conducive to work. I had, at the point of registration, 11 active clients and a waiting list of 2. Theodora revised her projections upward. I did not tell my family when I left Mercer Holt. I did not tell them about the studio. I drove past my parents' house on Wentworth Avenue twice in those 18 months, once to drop something off for my mother's birthday, once at Christmas, and both times I stayed for the duration of the meal and left afterward, and neither visit included a conversation about my work beyond my father's standard question of whether things were going well at the agency, to which I said yes, because at that point they were, and I did not offer supplementary information. My family had a picture of me that was approximately 5 years out of date. I was not responsible for updating it. Updating it would have required them to have asked. The studio grew in the way that things grow when the foundation is correctly built. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a consistency that compounded. By year 3, I had moved from the shared workspace on Carmichael Street into a dedicated office on the 4th floor of a building 12 minutes away, with 3 full-time employees and 2 regular contractors, and a client list that had expanded from small and medium local businesses into a regional client base that included 2 national brands. By year 5, the studio had a reputation in the sector that I had not manufactured but had allowed to accumulate through the work, through the referrals, through the outcomes clients could point to when they talked about what working with us had produced. I had a team meeting every Monday morning in the office. I had a Thursday afternoon slot I kept clear for thinking and for the occasional conversation with Theodora, whose projections I had now exceeded twice. I had a business bank account with a balance I reviewed weekly and a personal account that was entirely separate and that had, after the studio reached its 4th year, become comfortable in a way that I had anticipated as a possibility but had not permitted myself to assume. I had not spoken to Yolanda in 7 years. I had spoken to my mother occasionally, at intervals on the phone, for the duration of conversations that were pleasant enough in the way of conversations that have been carefully bounded, and to my father less often. Neither parent had asked about the studio. Neither parent knew about the studio. Yolanda, as far as I could determine from the information that filtered through my mother's calls, had navigated Claude's restructuring, had kept the children in their school, had managed the variable rate mortgage through 2 more adjustments. Her life had continued. It had not required my $43,700 to continue, which was the thing I had known on the October Sunday and which had been confirmed by time. The call came on a Wednesday. My mother called in the morning, which was unusual. She generally called in the evenings, at a time calibrated to when she thought I would be home from the agency, a calculation that had been incorrect for 5 years. I answered. She said she needed to speak to me about something. I said of course. She said that Yolanda was looking for work. I waited. She said that Claude's business had, in the most recent restructuring, reduced significantly, not collapsed, but contracted to a scale that required Yolanda to return to employment after 7 years of managing the household. Yolanda had a background in marketing. She had worked for 6 years before Claude's first business expansion had made it practical for her to step back. She had kept up with developments in the field, taken courses, maintained her professional registration. She was, by my mother's account, well-qualified and motivated, and finding the re-entry process more difficult than anticipated because 7 years was a long time and the market had shifted. My mother said, "I thought perhaps you might know of something." I let the sentence sit for a moment. "What does Yolanda do specifically?" I said, "In marketing. Brand communications," my mother said. She was always very good at it. Brand communications. I had been running a brand identity studio for 5 years. I had a marketing function that had been handled by a combination of myself and a contractor named Prida Sharma, who had been with me for 2 years and whose skills were excellent and whose capacity was at its limit and who I had been considering for 3 months whether to replace with a full-time in-house hire. I said, "I'll have to think about it, Mum." She said she would be very grateful. I said I would be in touch. I ended the call. I sat at my desk on the 4th floor of the building on Carmichael Street. We had moved back to a larger space in the same building 2 years earlier, and looked at the view, which was rooftops and a section of the city skyline that I had been looking at long enough to know it by its changes. I thought about the Monday morning team meetings and the Thursday afternoons and the client list and the waiting list and the business bank account and Theodora's revised projections. I thought about the October Sunday and the oval table and the flat gray light and the sentence my father had said 21 years earlier and had retrieved, intact and unexamined, when he was 62 years old. Then I called Theodora. I told her I was considering a full-time hire for marketing and asked her to model the cost against the current revenue trajectory. She said she'd send something by Friday. I said thank you. I did not call Yolanda that week. I called her the following Monday after I had reviewed Theodora's modeling, after I had spoken to Graham fairly about the employment structure, after I had thought through what the role would require and what I would need from the person in it, and whether those requirements were things I could assess fairly in a person I had not spoken to in 7 years. I had decided that I could assess them fairly only if I treated the process the same way I would treat any hire, formally, with a proper brief and a structured conversation, and an honest evaluation of fit. If Yolanda was the right person for the role, I would know after the conversation. If she wasn't, I would know that too. I called her on a Monday morning. She answered on the third ring. I said, "It's Imara." A pause. I said, "Mom said you're looking for work in brand communications." Another pause, shorter. She said yes. I said, "I have a role that might be appropriate. I'd like to have a proper conversation about it. Can you come to my office on Thursday?" She said, "Your office?" "Yes," I said. "Thursday at 2, if that works." A pause that was longer than the others. Then she said, "Thursday at 2. She arrived at 2:05. I watched her come into the reception area from the doorway of the meeting room, the studio's reception area, with the logo on the wall that I had designed myself 6 years ago and refined twice since, the one that said Osei Bonsu Studio in a typeface I had spent 3 weeks selecting. My receptionist, a young man named Kwesi, who had been with me for 8 months and who had the particular quality of making every person who walked in feel that their arrival was the most well-timed thing that had happened that day, showed her to the meeting room. She was wearing a navy blazer. She had a portfolio under her arm. She had prepared, and the preparation was visible, and I noted it the way I noted anything that told me about a person's relationship to the work they were presenting themselves to do. I came in. I sat across from her. I said, "Thank you for coming." She looked at the room. She looked at the logo on the glass wall of the meeting room, which also said Osei Bonsu Studio. She looked at me. "You built this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands, which were on the table in front of her, portfolio to one side, stayed still. "How long?" she asked. "The studio is 5 years old," I said. "I left Mercer Holt 7 years ago. About a month after the Sunday at Mum and Dad's." She looked at the table. One breath, measured. Then she looked back up. "Tell me about the role," she said. I told her about the role. I told her what the studio did, and what the marketing function had been, and what it needed to become. I asked her about her background and her skills and the courses she had taken and the campaigns she could speak to from her years at her previous employer. She answered well. She was, as my mother had said, qualified, not in a way that required adjustment, but in a way that was straightforwardly relevant to what I needed. Her 7 years away from employment had given her a particular perspective on the consumer side of brand communication that was, in one specific application I could already see, directly useful. At the end of an hour, I told her I would be in touch by the end of the week. She nodded. She picked up her portfolio. She stood up. At the door of the meeting room, she stopped. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was the particular one of a person who has decided to say something they have been holding for a long time and has chosen to say it now because the now is the only one available. "I should have come to you directly," she said. "In October. 14 years ago. Not at the table with Mum and Dad. I should have called you, just the two of us, and told you what was actually happening." A pause. "I didn't think of it that way then. I've thought about it since." I held her look for a moment. "I know," I said. "Thank you for saying it." She nodded. She left. I offered her the role the following Friday. She accepted it. She started the first Monday of the following month, which was a Monday in March, and she came in at 8:50 and Kwesi showed her to her desk and I introduced her to the team at the Monday morning meeting as our new head of marketing communications. The team did not know she was my sister. I had not told them because it was not relevant to the work and because the work was what mattered, and I had decided, when I made the offer, that the terms of her employment would be the same terms I offered any hire. Fair, documented, reviewed annually, connected to outcomes she could influence and be assessed against. Theodora had signed off on the salary. Graham had drafted the contract. The contract was the contract. She is good at the work. I knew she would be, from the Thursday conversation, but knowing and seeing are different, and seeing her operate in the first quarter, the clarity of her thinking about how the studio was presenting itself externally, the specific campaign she developed for a client in the hospitality sector that produced results the client called the best they had seen in the 3 years they had worked with us, confirmed what the Thursday conversation had indicated. My parents came to the studio at the end of the second month. Yawanda had told them where she was working. They came on a Thursday afternoon, which is the slot I keep clear, and I met them in the reception area. My father looked at the logo for a long time. My mother looked at the people at their desks through the glass partition. Neither of them said anything immediately. My father said, "You've been here 5 years." "Yes," I said. He said, "We didn't know." I said, "No." He looked at me with the expression of a man who is performing an internal audit and finding that the numbers don't reconcile the way he thought they would. His hands, in his jacket pockets, were still. He said, "I said something unfair to you. At the table. Years ago." He did not specify which Sunday or which sentence. We both knew which one. And before that, too, he added, which was the part one had not expected and which told me he had been doing the audit for longer than this visit. "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry for it," he said. I looked at him. He was 70 years old, and his hair was almost entirely gray, and he had the upright posture of a man who had spent his professional life in hard hats and side offices, and he was standing in the reception area of a studio his daughter had built without his knowledge, and looking at her with the expression of someone who has arrived at a destination they did not know they were traveling toward. "Thank you," I said. "Come and have tea." We had tea in the kitchen at the back of the studio. My mother asked about the clients. I told her. My father asked about the building, the structure, the lease, the floor plan, the questions of a civil engineer in an unfamiliar building. I answered them. We stayed for an hour. When they left, my mother put her hand on my arm in the particular way she had always done when she was communicating something she did not have words for. I put my hand over hers for a moment. Then they went. I am 35 years old. Osei Bonsu Studio is in its 6th year. The client list has continued to grow in the way that things grow when the work is consistently done well, and the clients tell other clients. We are a team of 7 full-time staff, including Yawanda, who received her first annual review 8 months ago and who Theodora described, when I told her the review outcome, as a strong hire. I agreed. My savings account, which was $43,700 on an October Sunday 7 years ago, is no longer the number it was. I do not discuss the current number because it is not the point of the story. The point of the story is what the number was for. My father sends me articles about construction and planning. He started doing this after the visit to the studio, and I have come to understand it as his version of continuing a conversation that we began late and are now conducting in the only register that feels safe to both of us. My mother calls on Wednesday evenings. Yawanda and I have lunch on the second Friday of every month at a place near the studio that has good coffee and unremarkable food, and that we have returned to enough times that it has become the place where we have lunch, which is its own kind of thing. We have not had a direct conversation about the October Sunday. I do not know if we will. What I know is that we are 2 people who work in the same building and have lunch on the second Friday of the month and speak to each other with the careful respect of people who understand that the relationship they have now is not the one they had before and is worth not disturbing. There is something I have come to understand about the 7 years between that Sunday and the Thursday when Yawanda walked into my meeting room. The work you do when no one is watching is the truest account of who you are. My family had a story about me, the selfish one, the one without responsibilities, the one whose savings could be redistributed because she hadn't built anything that required them. That story was wrong, but I did not argue with it. I just kept building, and the building eventually produced a room that the story couldn't fit inside. What you build in private becomes the fact that the story has to accommodate. It always does, eventually. Before you go, I want to ask you something specific about Thursday at 2 o'clock in the meeting room on the 4th floor. When Yawanda stopped at the door before leaving and turned around and said, "I should have come to you directly," there was one other person visible through the glass partition at that moment. Kwesi, at the reception desk. He did not hear what she said. but he saw the moment. And I have always wondered, what do you think he made of it? A woman in a navy blazer, portfolio under her arm, stopping at the door and turning back to say something to me? What do you think he thought he was watching? Leave your answer below. I read every comment. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe. A new story comes out every week, and the next one might be exactly what you needed to hear.